Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
The Gemara's first discussion is about fixing a karfif. That means you have an area which is very large. It's more than 5,000 square amas, and it is fenced in, but not for human use, not for people to be walking in and out of. And therefore, you can't carry within it even though it has fences. The question is how you fix it, and there are two ways to fix it. Either you make it smaller by placing some objects within the enclosure to reduce its land size, or you re-fence it for human use. That means even if you open a door from a house leading into this big enclosure so that people are going to be walking around in there, but you have to redo the fences. You can't have the fences already up and then make it human use. So now we're going to discuss how do you reduce the area, what's effective for reducing the area, and what's an effective way of redoing the fences. The type of redoing the fences, which we'll discuss at first here, is where you're just building another fence within the old fence. You're adding to the old fence, you're adding a new fence, you're leaving the old one up, but you're adding one within so that you're now enclosing a smaller area, but your strategy is not to make the area smaller. Your strategy is to have another fencing. So the Gemara first discusses the reduction of the area, how you reduce the area, and here we're going to have three different approaches with the machlokes on two of them, and that machlokes will also apply to other situations. And the Gemara says as follows. First of all, if you want to reduce the area of the 5,000 square amas, of the more than 5,000 square amas by planting trees, so that there's less actual area to use, that doesn't count. Trees are normally planted in such an area, and therefore they're buttled to the rest of the land. They don't count as a reduction. If, however, you want to put pillars in there, so that doesn't belong there, and that would reduce the area, as long as the pillars are at least 10 tvachim high, which means it's a separate rishus. And how wide does it has to be? That's a bit of a question. If it's 4 tvachim wide, it's for sure good. If it's less than 3 tvachim wide, it's for sure no good. 3 tvachim wide is insignificant. It doesn't even count as anything because it's less than lavud. The question is if the width is between 3 and 4 tvachim. That's a machlokes between Rabba and Rava. Rabba said it does count because it's not lavud, so it's a significant step. Rava says no, it has to be as big as a rishus. We know that in order for something to be a significant place, significant area, it's got to be at least 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim. So therefore this pillar, in order to take away from the general land of the karfef, the pillar has to be at least 4 tvachim wide. So that's the machlokes. Do we say it has to be a separate rishus, or we say it has to be just not lavud, and the case is between 3 and 4 tvachim wide? Then there's a third way of reducing the land area, and that's if you apply a thick layer of mud to the fence, and that will take away part of the actual internal space. So that thick layer of mud is good as long as it reduces the space. The question is, does the mud have to be strong enough and thick enough to stand on its own? According to Rava, it has to be. According to Rabba, it does not have to be enough to stand on its own, because at least it's standing. Now, what do I care if it's strong enough to stand on its own or not? Okay, now, as far as building another fence, or another wall of a fence that'll be within the old fence, so here we have a very similar machlokes between Rabba and Rava. If the fence is between 3 or 4 tvachim from the old fence, that's where we have a machlokes. If it's less than 3 tvachim from the old fence, it's lavud to the old fence, it just counts as part of the old fence, and therefore you didn't change anything, that's no good. If it's greater than 4 tvachim, it's for sure good. The question is between 3 and 4 tvachim. According to Rabba, again, that's okay because at least it's not lavud. According to Rava, it's not okay because you have to be far enough from the old fence that it's a separate rishus. You're closing off that rishus. Okay. Now, the Gemara says that Rav Simi had a slightly different version of this machlokes Rav and Rava. He said they weren't arguing about between 3 and 4 tvachim, they were arguing about less than 3 tvachim. That's what their machlokes was. It's a machlokes, but that's what it was about. Okay. Now the Gemara goes to another situation of reducing, adding a fence so that you are re-enclosing the karfef, which now has a door open into it. It's now residential. The Gemara says the case over here is where one of the walls of the karfef was actually not a real fence, it was a hilltop. It was a little hill, and the hill counted as a wall. And now the question is, I want to add a fence inside on the inner edge of that hill so that I'm now making a new enclosure. So what do you have to do over here? So the Gemara says the best thing to do is to make sure that your new wall is more than 4 tefachim from the hill. So more than 4 tefachim from the hill, then it's for sure your new enclosure, and then it's okay. If it's less than 3 tefachim, it's a machlokas of Rav Chizda and Rav Hamnuna. One says it's good and one says it isn't. And now the Gemara says there's another machlokas between Rav Chizda and Rav Hamnuna, and this is going to be the primary discussion for the next while. And that is what happens if you put a fence on the top corner, the top edge of the hill, up on top of the hill. So now this is what we call a fence on top of a fence. The hilltop itself counts as a fence. It's a steep enough slope that it's a wall in and of itself. And you're adding another fence on top of that, you're just adding a wall on top of an existing wall. That's also machlekes of Rav Chizda and Rav Hamnuna, whether an existing wall added to the top of another wall works or not. And the Gemara says, let's prove that Rav Chizda is the one who says it works, as we have a different machlekes between Rav Chizda and Rav Sheshes. And over there, Rav Chizda says that it works, and Rav Sheshes says it does not work. Now, this halacha about adding a wall on top of an existing wall also applies to another case, and that is nichse hager, the property of somebody who died with no relatives whatsoever to inherit him. That can only happen if somebody converted, and therefore all his relatives are halachically not counted anymore, and then he never had any additional relatives. So his property becomes hefker, becomes ownerless, and the first person who grabs it gets to keep it, and the way to grab it is by fencing it in. So if you added a fence on top of an existing fence, there Rav Chizda and Rav Sheshes agree that doesn't count. You have not acquired that land. However, as far as Hilchos Shabbos, we have this machlokes, and Rav Chizda is the one who says that it does work, even though it's on top of an existing wall. Rav Sheshes is like a Rav Hamnuna who says that it does not work as far as Hilchos Shabbos on an existing wall. Okay, now the Gemara explores this halacha of a wall on top of a wall a little bit further. First of all, the Gemara says if you have a group of people living on top of a plateau, there are walls extending downwards from their living surface. But because those walls aren't relevant to them, they don't see them and they're not part of their life, so if you put walls up there on top of the plateau, that does count as walls. We don't say it's walls on top of walls, because relative to them, they're living on a flat ground. What do they care that the land drops away to the sides? That it is not a wall relative to them, and therefore your additional wall counts as a wall. Okay, now the Gemara asks, Rabbi Chana asks, what happens if you built a wall on top of a wall, and then the bottom wall sunk into the ground? Your existing wall, the wall that you added on top, is now the only wall that there is. Does that count as walls or not? The Gemara now says, regarding what halacha are you asking this question exactly? About acquiring the property that is hefker, that is ownerless, or about making walls for Hilchos Shabbos? And the Gemara is going to say that really your question doesn't make sense in either one. If you're talking about acquiring the property which is hefker, all you have to do for that is do a slight improvement. And the slight improvement has to be that you are doing it. It can't be that the improvement happened on its own after you did something based on something you did. Now we see this from a statement of Rav Yirmiyah Biro in the name of Rav Yehuda, who said that let's say there was hefker land and somebody threw a turnip into the ground, and later it became sunk into the ground and it grew a turnip plant on its own. So that's an improvement, but you didn't do any improvement. All you did was throw the turnip into the ground. That didn't do anything for it. Later it grew on its own. That's not considered something you did. If somebody else came later and he prepared the ground for planting by spading the earth a bit with a shovel, he would get the land because he improved it. So you see that something which happens after you finish, based on something you did, that's an improvement, doesn't count. So here you built a fence on top of an existing fence that did nothing, and then when the first fence sunk into the ground and your fence became significant, it wasn't you who did it, and therefore it doesn't count. So the Gemara says it must be that we're discussing Hilchos Shabbos. Do these walls that are now the only existing walls count as Hilchos Shabbos? So the Gemara says, well, this is something we've discussed many times in the past. We have walls that form themselves. Instead, if you have walls that form themselves, whether b'shegeg, b'mezid, by accident, on purpose, whatever it is, as long as the walls exist, even if they come on Shabbos, the walls count. And now the fence in areas of Rosh Hashanah. Somebody says, well, hold on a second. But Rav Nachman said that halacha is only true l'chumra, that you're not allowed to carry something from outside those walls to within those walls. L'kula, leniently to carry within those walls, that we don't see. Rav Nachman said that's not what that halacha is referring to. So Gemara says, no. Rav Nachman said that distinction, that limitation, only when somebody creates walls on Shabbos on purpose. On that, he said he violated Hilchos Shabbos, and therefore he only gets messed over by what he did. those walls make it forbidden for him to carry from outside the wall. So within the walls, but he can't carry within the walls. It's only walls of Chumrah. But in other cases where the walls came on their own, or if they came by accident, there it does count as significant walls, and that's the answer to your question, therefore, that you don't have to worry about how these walls came. As long as the walls are there, you're allowed to use them on Shabbos. Okay, now as far as the halacha about somebody who made a wall on top of a wall, we had seen that Rav Chizr and Rav Sheshes both agreed that it doesn't work to acquire hefker land. The Gemara has a story about this. The Gemara says there was a man who was a convert. He died without children. His land was hefker, and a woman tried to acquire it by building a wall on top of an existing wall. And then another man came and he spaded the earth a little bit, so he improved it. And they came to Rav Nachman as to who's the one who did the improvement that acquires the land, and Rav Nachman said it goes to the guy with the shovel. So she screamed at him and she said, "What are you talking about? I built the wall." So he said, Rav Nachman said, "What can I do for you? You built a wall, which is not a normal way of building a wall. That's not how you acquire land, and therefore that didn't count." Gemara now goes back to an overly large area, which is therefore forbidden to carry within. It's not residential and it's too big. The Gemara has another strategy for reducing the area spacing, which is what happens if I roof part of the area, put a roof over it. This will depend on the halacha of pitikra yerid v'saisim, which is that a roof counts as a wall. We view the edge of the roof as if it extends downward to the ground and forms a wall. If I can view the roof as a wall, then I can cut off that roofed area from the rest of the enclosure, from the rest of the karfeif. And if it's less than base sisayim, if it's less than 5,000, if it's 5,000 square amas or less, it should be okay. The Gemara says whether this roof works or not is a machlokes between Rabbi Zera and Rava, possibly Rabba, depending on the girsa. Rabbi Zera said it does not separate it, the roof doesn't count as a wall, and Rava says it does. The Gemara says that this sounds like this is the same machlokes about Rav and Shmuel, about if you roofed an area in a bika, in an open field, can you carry with inside that area? Does it count as if it's roofed off or not? That machlokes was about if you have just a roof, all four sides are open. That means you want the roof to serve as all four walls. That's the issue there. So this sounds like it's the same issue. Can the roof serve as all four walls? Shmuel says you have to have at least one other wall, and Rav says that it's not. It can be all four walls. So the Gemara says no, the two machlokes are not related. Here, Rabba and Rabbi Zera both agree that you could have a roof serve all four walls. The problem here is that this is a slanted roof. And it's not pashut that a slanted roof counts as a roof at all in order to be able to create walls. And that's what they're arguing about. Can the slanted roof function as walls in order to set off this area and make the entire enclosure less than 5,000 square amas or equal to 5,000 square amas? The Gemara now brings a case in which Rav Zera agrees, and the Gemara is going to have some discussion of figuring out why Rav Zera agrees that an additional area counts as part of the karfeif to make it an overly large size. So the case, the Gemara says as follows: you have a karfeif which is exactly base sisayim. It's exactly 5,000 square amas, therefore it's not too big. You're allowed to carry within it. But that karfeif, one of its walls, is a shared wall with somebody's chutzner, and then that wall fell down. And now it's completely exposed. So the chutzner seemingly adds on to the space, and now it's more than 5,000 square amas, and it's forbidden to carry within the karfeif. So Gemara says, well, why should this be a problem? I don't understand. Don't tell me that the chutzner, the courtyard, adds on to the area of the karfeif, and now it's more than 5,000 square amas. It's not true. The chutzner, you're allowed to... It's a residential area. It's for people to walk around in. That's what it's for. So it's not a karfeif type area. You should be allowed to carry within the chutzner. You should be allowed, and that shouldn't add to the karfeif because it's not the same structure where it's not meant for people to walk in. So Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me the reason is because it's two separate areas. One's a karfeif, one's a chutzner. So Gemara says that makes sense if you couldn't carry from a karfeif to a chutzner. So it's exposed, and the wall fell down between, and now you can't carry within the karfeif itself, because we know the rule: if one area is exposed to another area, and you can't carry across, then you can't carry within either of them. But here, a karfeif is a rishos hayachid. It's enclosed. It's less than it's 5,000 square amas or less, and the chutzner you're allowed to carry it within. So you're allowed to carry in both of them. So what's the problem? So Abai says, first of all, that's only according to Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon says you're allowed to carry from one chutzner to a karfeif to different types of rishos yachid. According to their banan, we said you can't carry from different zones, even if they're all rishos yachid. You can't carry from a roof to a karfeif to a chutzner. All these things you can't do. Second of all, Abai says even according to Reb Shimon, this is problematic, and that's because the wall itself has a thickness. That thickness of the wall is now gone. It's now open space, and that open space was never residential. It was never for people to walk around in. It was a wall. And now that adds on to the karfif. If you remember, the karfif was exactly 5,000 square amas. Well, now it's more than 5,000 square amas. And Abai says, I'll show you that there's a halacha that Rav Chisda says, which must be the same halacha. Rav Chisda says that if you have a karfif connected to a chutzner and the wall falls down, very similar case. So he says you're allowed to carry in the chutzner, but you're not allowed to carry in the karfif. So what could be the reason for that? Why should you be able to carry in the chutzner and not the karfif? So the Gemara first says, well, maybe it was built in such a way that the entire wall of the karfif fell down, so it's fully open, but not the entire wall of the chutzner fell down, meaning the adjoining wall was the entire side of the karfif, but if you're standing in the chutzner, there is an extension on either side. It's T-shaped where they meet. Therefore, the entire karfif is not exposed to the chutzner, and therefore it's a problem, and the chutzner is not totally exposed to the karfif. So for instance, that can't be the pshat, because then it's not a halacha that has anything to do with the fact that one's a karfif and one's a chutzner. It's because one is fully exposed and one is not fully exposed. So then that's what Chizr should say. You can't see the karfif this, the chutzner that. That's nothing to do with it. So the reason must be because there's space, because there's the space of the wall. The space of the wall is now exposed, and that adds on to the karfif, making a larger than 5,000 square amma area that's not designed for residential use. Okay, now the Gemara adds a case here. We have a orchard, and it is walled on three sides, and the fourth side is the house. And the house serves as the fourth wall. Then the wall of the house, which forms the wall of the orchard, collapses. Now, the three walls besides the house were put up as a karfif. It was not meant to be residential. When they put up the wall of the house, they made a door into the orchard and said, hey, let's make this into a nice yard, a nice place to go for a stroll, and therefore the fourth wall is what made it residential. Now that fourth wall fell down. It's not residential anymore. So Rav Bivi, who's the son of Abaye, wanted to say, okay, but you know what? The house has another wall on the other side. It has a front wall. So that front wall could count as the fourth wall of this yard, and it's still all residential. So on that, Rav Papi said to Rav Bivi, it's not true. And he used the following expression of surprise. He said, just because you're from shortened people doesn't mean you have to say shortened halacha. Shortened people means that Rav Bibi was the son of Abaye, was descended from Eli HaKohen, and all Eli HaKohen's descendants died at a young age. So therefore they're all called the people who are shortened. But you're saying a shortened halacha here, meaning that it's not a true halacha. That wall is made for the inside of the house. It wasn't made for the karfif, and therefore it doesn't count to make the karfif into a residential area that people are meant to be walking around in, and therefore it's still forbidden to walk in the karfif. The only walls that it has are put up for non-human use purposes, and that's the other three walls of the area.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.